Right, so thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. And here I am in the second part of my videos on the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, and we've covered the first one. I think the time has now come to recapitulate, since we've now covered two murders, as well as Mary Ann Nichols. We've done Martha Tabram, and really trying to put all these things in context so that you can actually much better understand the significance in which they took place. It's worth remembering we're talking about 1888. Police methods have changed a great deal in the past 140 years. With the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, just a local man went along and cleared up the mess. He just threw a bucket of water over the pavement and scrubbed down the paving stones to get rid of any sight of the trace of the murder having taken place. Police methods are now very, very different. If a murder like that to happen like that today, what they would do is cordon off the entire street, and you'd get forensic scientists coming down to examine every single square inch. But in those days they didn't know anything at all about well, they didn't have very much forensic science, and they hardly knew anything at all about blood groups and fingerprints or anything like that. Now, it's been a great mystery to people to know about Jack the Ripper and how he committed the murders. And there were many people at the time who thought that what he did was sneak up behind his victims and then cut their throat. As he came from behind, he would cut their throats. What actually happened was, they now reckon, they're examining the evidence in these murders, that the victims had bruise marks on their necks. And it seems that really what happened was, the best explanation is that Jack the Ripper allowed his victims to take him to a quiet and secluded place, and then at the psychologically correct moment he put his hand around her throat. The idea was then to block off the flow of blood to the brain, and so within a few seconds she would go unconscious, and then body would just fall down on the floor, fall down on the ground. It was then that he took out his knife. His knife would be about 6 or 8 inches long, and he would then lift up the skirt of his victim and then start cutting into the body, pulling out the various internal organs and spreading them around the corpse in order to create a horrific sight for the next person who came along. It's important to understand that there was never at any time any evidence of any sexual engagement between Jack the Ripper and his victims. Jack the Ripper was not seeking the services of a prostitute, and psychologists who study the case say that his motive was primarily revenge, not particularly against these unfortunate women who had not done him anything wrong, but it had a deeply embedded psychological archetype of his mother, or women who had abused him in early childhood. Perhaps he was brought up in an orphanage or something and badly mistreated. That's perfectly understandable. So the murders created a great deal of mystery from the very outset, and people couldn't understand. I mean, when murders usually happen, they happen between people who already know each other, probably quite well. It might even be husband and wife. But murders like serial killing are always a problem to the police, even today, and people had no idea who the murderer was. There were some people who came up with the idea that the murders were being committed by a gorilla or an orangutan that had been brought in by one of the ships and was in the port of London, had escaped from the ship and was running around the streets and running around the rooftops, jumping on victims. That idea came from a story written by Edgar Allan Poe called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. I think that came out in 1841. But it was a very popular idea at the time. There were some people, and it's still very much the case today, they think the murder was committed by a very respectable doctor living in the West End of London somewhere. And that idea is taken from Robert Louis Stevenson's novella called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is the story about a very respectable West End doctor who creates some sort of serum by which he can transform his personality, and rather than being the very respectable Dr. Jekyll, he then becomes the monstrous Mr. Hyde, who goes out into the streets and commits all sorts of atrocities. Now, this was a very popular play. It was on the stage in the West End at the time, being performed by an American actor called Richard Mansfield. And so that made a great sensation at the time, and it's only natural that the idea should then rub off on the idea that was the Ripper murders. In fact, Richard Mansfield is one of the suspects, not a very serious one from my point of view, but people who thought he may have been doing a little bit of method acting and sort of going out into the streets committing women to psych himself up for the part. I don't think that, but there's some people who do. Alternative explanations, well, that the Ripper was a lunatic. They didn't know very much about lunacy. Actually, psychology, the science of psychology, was only in its infancy, so that didn't really take them very far. And the other explanation was that it was a foreigner. Well, what sort of foreigner? Well, there were several foreigners. This is, after all, the East End of London. We're talking about Whitechapel, and Whitechapel is very near the docks, and this is the place where people who are migrating to England, this is where they first settle down. So this place is full of people from all sorts of different nations. So, in 1888, they reckon, well, the statistics show that there were 42 murders within the metropolitan area of London. That means that 36 of them were committed by people with perfectly normal motives. But from the outset, as I say, these murders were committed by somebody who had no clear and comprehensible motive, so that made it all the more difficult. When we look back to the other murders, there was a murder, as I say, of Emma Smith in April of 1888. And there were many people who thought at the time that the murders were being committed by a gang. There were many criminal gangs that were operating in Whitechapel at the time. And one of the gang leaders was a man they called the Leather Apron. They just called him the Leather Apron. They didn't know what else to call him. And the gang itself called itself the High Rip Gang. And say they made a practice of threatening prostitutes and then robbing them of all the money they'd earned. So, we then have to move on, and we have to say, well, what sort of context did all these murders take place? What was the historical context? Well, we're living in the Victorian period, and what we mean by that is that the head of state at that time was Queen Victoria, who was a 69-year-old woman. Since 1876, she had been the Empress of India, and the British Empire at that time was extending itself. It was extending itself into places like Egypt and the Sudan, Bechuanaland, I think that's now called Botswana, but places also like New Guinea and Nigeria. Queen Victoria was the last of the Hanoverian monarchs. She married a man called Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and that established an entirely new dynasty, which we now call the House of Windsor. Now, Victoria celebrated her 50th anniversary on the throne. That's her Golden Jubilee in 1887. Queen Victoria didn't run the country entirely by herself. In fact, she had to run the country, according to the Constitution, with a Prime Minister and with Parliament. And that had been the situation ever since the civil wars of the mid-1600s. By that time, after the Civil War, we had two political parties emerge. They were called the Whigs and the Tories, and these parties over time evolved into the Liberals and the Conservatives. And generally speaking, the Conservative Party supported the landed interest, the landed gentry, people who owned land, whereas the Liberal Party supported those people in manufacturing industry. I should point out also that socialism as a political force was starting to emerge in the 1880s and would of course continue to do so. In 1888, the Prime Minister who was advising Queen Victoria was a man called Robert Gascoigne Cecil. That was his second ministry. He came into office in July of 1886 for the second time. And one of his ancestors, 300 years earlier, was Queen Elizabeth I. And one of the great political issues which they had to consider at the time was what they called the Irish question. The question of what was the relationship of Ireland, or what should the relationship of Ireland be to the rest of the United Kingdom. Ireland had been incorporated into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in 1801. However, it was not a very happy marriage, put it mildly. There were great disputes about land tenure. There was a terrible famine that took place in Ireland in the 1840s, from which many people died and many other people emigrated. Some went to America, some came to Britain and settled here. So from the 1860s, we had several, the movement to talk about the Irish question went off in several different directions. There were terrorists, people who simply wanted to establish Ireland as a republic. They were called the Fenians, and they made themselves very evident in 1867 with the planting of a bomb outside Clerkenwell jail, which exploded, killing 12 civilians and wounding 120 more. Nevertheless, some people chose the parliamentary road, and there was an Irish parliamentary party which came into the House of Commons by 1874, and they started pressing for, effectively, would have been Dominion status, so that Ireland would have been recognised, would have its own parliament, but it'd be rather like Canada in a sense that it would still retain the Queen as their Queen and conduct a common foreign policy with the rest of the United Kingdom. So things went on. The Fenians were still very active. They murdered a man called Lord Frederick Cavendish in 1882, and 2 years later, in 1884, they started planting bombs in Victoria Station, also in Scotland Yard in Whitehall, and also in St James's Square. There was a failed attempt to bomb London Bridge, which fortunately didn't happen. And I say, we were living in London, and London at that time had a population of over 5 million people. That may not sound very much today, because today London has a population of about 10 million. And London, of course, was still growing at that time, was still growing now. London was the wealthiest city in the world. It was the hub of the British Empire, and also of international communications, made possible with the creation of the telegraph. All these things were new at the time, and they were considered to be amazing. And London had grown and expanded and developed, especially in the West End. We had places like Trafalgar Square, Regent Street with all the shopping opportunities, the very wealthy suburbs in Mayfair and Belgravia, South Kensington and so forth. London had all the amenities of a modern city. We had buses since 1829. We had a postal service, well, the National Postal Service, also since 1829. We had a fire brigade in 1833. We had a National Gallery in 1838, a place where they exhibited famous paintings to which the public were admitted free of charge. They had the Great Exhibition in 1851 in Hyde Park, and that was the occasion when they brought together a special exhibition of all the manufacturing industries of the manufacturing nations of the world, all concentrated in the great exhibition, which was called the Crystal Palace, a building made almost entirely of steel and glass. It was the great miracle of its age. We also had the museums of South Kensington. They were made possible by the Great Exhibition. The profits from the Great Exhibition went to create the museums of South Kensington. We had a fire brigade from 1866, the Royal Albert Hall from 1871. So London continued to grow and expand in all directions, although the government of London was still conducted very much as it was in medieval times. We had the square mile of the historic city of London, the Roman and medieval city, governed according to its own constitution, which really hadn't changed in any significant respect since the time of Magna Carta. Westminster became a city in 1540. It was given a special charter by Henry VIII. And then dotted around the Twin Cities, you had all these little villages with their churches, and it was still governed as by the parishes, the parish administration. However, they created a body called the London Board of Works in 1855, and they took upon themselves the responsibility of creating new streets. They also created, their great magnificent achievement was the embankment. In fact, they created not only the Victoria Embankment, the Albert Embankment, and the Chelsea Embankment. What they aimed for, this wasn't entirely satisfactory, and what eventually the Parliament wanted to do was to create a new county for London. So they took 4 corners of the adjacent counties and created a single county called the County of London. And then they created a special council for that. That really covered all the metropolitan area of London at the time, and they called it the London County Council. Now, the metropolitan area of London was policed by the Metropolitan Police, and the head man, the chief of police, was a man called General Sir Charles Warren, born in 1840, died in 1927. He was born in Bangor in Wales. He trained at Sandhurst and Woolwich, and then served in the Royal Engineers. As a young man, he went out to Gibraltar, and while he was in Gibraltar, he was inducted into the Society of Freemasons. He became very interested in the story about the Temple of Solomon. He actually went, a bit later, he went off to Jerusalem to start digging on the Temple Mount, and it's Warren's shaft, which you find on the Temple Mount. It's still there. Later on, he fought in South Africa, and in the course of time, he eventually received a knighthood in 1871. Came back to England in 1886. He made an unsuccessful attempt to enter Parliament as the Liberal candidate for the constituency of Sheffield Hallam. He failed and was then, but nevertheless he was appointed as the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at that time. The press welcomed the appointment. They thought he was a new man, just what was needed to instill a bit of discipline in the police force, which had grown rather slack in time. But the press support for him dwindled dramatically after the events of Bloody Sunday in November of 1887. That was a demonstration which Charles Warren had actually expressly forbidden, but the demonstration went ahead, and it was broken up not only by the police but also by the army. In the beginning of 1888, Charles Warren was assisted by a man called James Monroe. He was 1838 to 1820. He was a Scotsman, educated in Edinburgh High School and also at Edinburgh University and Berlin University. He entered the Indian Civil Service and then served as an assistant magistrate and also as a collector of taxes and a district judge. He then became the Inspector of Police at the Bengal Presidency and eventually the Commissioner for the Police in the Bombay Presidency. So he was appointed the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in 1884. That was to say, however, in the early months of 1888, he proposed Sir Melville Macnaghten to serve as the Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, but this idea was vetoed by Warren because Sir Melville Macnaghten had actually had the misfortune to be beaten up by Indians during what might be thought of as a native uprising. But anyway, there was therefore ill will between James Monroe and Sir Charles Warren, and eventually James Monroe left. He gave in his notice, and he served out his notice. The last day he was working was the 31st of August 1888. That was the day in which Mary Ann Nichols was murdered. So after that, this transition, once Monroe had left, the job of Assistant Commissioner was taken up by Robert Anderson. and he was appointed to succeed him. Now, Anderson was an Irishman. He was born in Dublin of Protestant parentage. He received his BA from Trinity College in Dublin and was later called to the bar in 1863. Now, he, a man who'd worked extensively with the British government to combat the problems that were being posed by the Fenians, and he was appointed as a special advisor to the Home Office on political crimes. He overworked himself, and so by the time he took up office as the Assistant Commissioner, he said he would take up the job, but only on the understanding that he could actually take a month's leave before he really took up the job in earnest in October. So he was allowed to come in for the first week just to acquaint himself with his duties, and then the idea was that he would go off to on the continent, so went to Switzerland. In the meantime, Inspector Donald Swanson would take over his duties in the interim. Now, it was Donald Swanson was the man who was directly responsible for coordinating all the information relating to the murders of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. But he was working in Scotland Yard. He wasn't actually the man on the ground. The man on the ground here in Whitechapel at the time was Inspector George Aberline. Now, he was born in Dorset. He was also apprenticed for a while as a clockmaker, but he came to London. He joined the Metropolitan Police in 1863 and worked his way through the ranks till he became the inspector. He was based in Whitechapel from 1873 to 1887, and then eventually he was succeeded in that position by Edmund Reed. Now, in the 14 years that he worked in Whitechapel, he had gained a thorough knowledge of the area and all the villains and all the problems that Whitechapel, so he was obviously the best man to choose, and he was the man who took over the job of searching for the Ripper, and he did it on the ground. Now, what I'm going to do is just go through Valence Gardens, but just to show you what this area is. It's all a very ordinary part of London now. That's where local people come out to enjoy themselves. And I think I mentioned before that at one time it had actually served as a burial ground for the Quakers. And in 1864, William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army, it was he who had an enormous temperance meeting on these grounds in, as I say, in 1864. Now, what I propose to do is cross over the road when I can. I've got immediately ahead of me a red light, so I can't cross. Let's just see if we can coax the button.
Excuse me, chap, be careful your phone, okay?
Yes, thank you very much. Oh, we can cross. Right, so here, I've just brought you here because I want to show you the place where Old Montague Street, this is Old Montague Street, it's the street that leads over on the left-hand side, converges with Hanbury Street that leads over on the right. Of course, all this area has changed considerably since Victorian times, but it's just important. Hanbury Street, I bring you here because this, on the other side of the street, not just around here, but a little bit further forward, about 5 minutes walk away from here, we come to number 29 Hanbury Street, which was the scene of the murder of a lady called Annie Chapman. And I told you about the murder of Mary Ann Nichols on the 31st of August. This murder took place just over a week later. That was on Saturday, the 8th of September, and I'll talk about that in the next video. So thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Over and out for the time.